morning. Thank you for attending session A2 of the ASFPM conference. My name is Joe Wall. I'm a civil engineer at Barr Engineering in Minnesota and the chair of the Minnesota Association of Floodplain Managers. And I have the honor today of being our moderator. Our session today is Mitigation Successes in Loss Avoidance Studies. We have 3 excellent presentations lined up. Each presentation is about 20 to 25 minutes, which leaves us 5 to 10 minutes for questions at the end. And our presenters will be on live to answer those questions for you. I invite you to post those questions as they come up, as you think of them in the chat, and we'll moderate those, select those. You can also post other questions if you're having technical difficulties or things like that, and we can try and help in that way too. So feel free to post those questions as they come up. I also invite you to like questions. If questions that are liked help us sort out the ones that most people want to hear the answers to. So as questions are published in the chat, please like those questions. Our first presentation today is The Results Are In, Building Codes Save. Our presenters are Jonathan Westcott and Dr. Shane Parson. They are providing introductions as part of their video, so I won't go into their bios just now. So let's enjoy our first presentation.
Hello, my name is Jonathan Westcott. I'm a civil engineer at FEMA headquarters in our building science branch. I led the development of FEMA's Building Code Safe study, and I'm here with the lead subject matter expert for the flood module to tell you about it. I've been at FEMA since 2006, and I'm currently responsible for development of technical policy, standards, and guidance on building science issues. Prior to this role, I led FEMA's efforts to update our coastal flood mapping across the nation. Dr. Shane Parson served as the flood hazard lead for this study. He's a natural hazard and climate change modeling analyst with AECOM. He has over 30 years of experience conducting research and project studies for natural hazard simulations, risk assessment modeling, benefit cost and loss avoidance analysis, and hazard mitigation. Last year, we were here telling you all about our data and methodology and ongoing analysis. This year, we're happy to be here to tell you about the study results and how building codes save. Following my introduction, I'll pass it on to Dr. Parson to describe the study methodology and data processing. Shane will then provide an overview of the flood module results at the nationwide level and some North Carolina specific results. Then I'll wrap up by briefly highlighting some of our other findings and describing the brochure we developed as a companion to the study. We had lots of partners and contributors. Shane had a lot of support throughout AECOM, as did the other study leads, and we benefited from input from numerous FEMA subject matter experts along the way. Importantly, we had an external review panel consisting of members from the Federal Alliance for Safe Homes, the International Code Council, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, the National Association of Home Builders, the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety, a university, and a local official, all of whom provided review, oversight, and guidance for the study. We have even more partners in outreaching the results, including ASFPM, the Applied Technology Council, the Natural Hazard Center, and other organizations interested in code adoption. Lastly, I want to recognize Ed Latch at FEMA for providing the long-term vision and executive leadership for this study. FEMA places a strong emphasis on building codes because they enhance public safety and property protection. Model building codes are more disaster resistant than ever, and the benefits of strong code adoption and enforcement become evident following disasters. FEMA's mitigation assessment teams and others have documented significant reduction in damages to structures built to modern hazard-resistant codes. The National Institute of Building Sciences, in their Mitigation Save study, found that adopting modern building codes saves $11 for every $1 invested. Yet despite the effectiveness of modern building codes, disaster costs are huge and rising and affect tens of millions of Americans. That's why our nation's mitigation investment strategy calls for making mitigation standard practice and recognizes the importance of strong building codes in doing so. Still, surprisingly to some, about 2/3 of our nation's jurisdictions have not yet adopted a recent edition of the model codes. We need to change that in order to maximize their significant benefits. So the goals of the study are to demonstrate the monetary benefit of adopting hazard-resistant building codes, to do so by quantifying the effect of building codes in reducing losses during disasters, and importantly, to use our results to incentivize better code adoption. This study quantifies the losses avoided from the adoption of modern hazard-resistant building codes. Using big data sets and an engineering-based methodology, we've used HAZIS, FEMA's loss estimation tool, to model key structural characteristics of hazard-resistant building codes as they were adopted over time by communities across the country. Buildings constructed with these characteristics, which Shane will describe in some more detail, experience fewer losses when exposed to hurricane winds, flooding, and/or earthquakes, the three hazards we evaluated as part of this study. We found that the nation is saving $1.6 billion in average annualized losses avoided, thanks to the states and communities across the country that have adopted hazard-resistant building codes since 2000. Further, we estimate that about $32 billion has been saved over the past 20 years. And projecting forward, assuming contemporary development and adoption patterns continue, we could save $132 billion by 2040. Now that number goes up significantly if we improve code adoption across the country. There's a lot that goes into these results, but I want to point out that our analysis only accounts for buildings and contents damages. When you consider the cascading losses that are also avoided, such as relocation costs, business interruption, lost wages, and other socioeconomic factors, it's clear that the true value of hazard-resistant building codes is much greater. Now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Parson to describe the study methodology and data processing and provide an overview of the flood module results.
Hi, I'm Shane Parson with AECOM. I'm going to be talking through information in this presentation about the study's methods, data, and also the flood analysis. So let's get started with a few definitions of terms that we're going to be using throughout this talk. The first is average annualized loss, or AAL. So this refers to an analysis that looks at multiple return periods or multiple events, and then does a weighting of the damages from each event in order to get an average annualized or a single value that represents the expected losses for a given year. A related term is average annualized losses avoided. What that represents is the comparison of two scenarios. In the case of this study, a with building code and without building code, running AALs for both of those, taking the difference. And the difference between those then is the losses avoided, or the AALA for average annualized losses avoided. So building on past work from pilot and regional studies, we came up with a methodology where first we looked at data collection for assets at risk, hazards, and code adoption. We use that information to then be able to assign to individual structures their with and without code conditions and the damages associated with them through damage curves or fragility curves. We then ran them in either HAZIS or used HAZIS-like frameworks, came up with results, and calculated losses avoided, so comparing with and without code conditions, and then reviewed the data for quality, making sure that both the model runs were consistent and we were seeing the geographic trends that we would expect with the data that we had. So those were our main steps. So the way that this was performed was to have assumed pre and post code conditions that could be represented in model like HAZIS. For our flood analysis, this comparison was with and without freeboard. So the post code or with code would be structures that had some level of freeboard implemented. And the pre-code would be those that were built to just a standard FEMA NFIP minimum requirement, which is first floor elevations at the base flood elevation, or commonly referred to as the 100-year 1% annual chance event. So that comparison of the damages from different elevations of the first floor is what results in the losses avoided from the flood analysis. This figure also shows for hurricane and for earthquake, the pre and post code comparisons of the additional shutters and opening protections and roof connections for hurricane, and then also the various seismic improvements that are used in those designs as well. But again, the point of the computations is being able to have a difference between with and without code and being able to represent that in models such as HAZIS so that we actually can derive a numeric calculation of the losses avoided associated with that code adoption. The three primary data sets needed to perform the study were asset or structure data, code adoption data, and then hazard severity data. Our asset information for structures came primarily from a CoreLogic national parcel layer that provided near national coverage throughout the US of information about parcels and structures. This was also supplemented with data from Microsoft Bing about building locations, allowing us to go from parcels to buildings. For code adoption, again, we used a combination of national data sources from the ICC. We also incorporated other data to look at local adoption, for instance, the BSEGS ratings. And then for certain hazards, we also looked at other supplemental local or national data sets. We'll talk about the use of the CRS data for flood later on. Our final set of data were hazard information, and these came from the sources as you'd expect from one hazard to the other. So for flood, primarily was FEMA and the National Flood Hazard Layer. For hurricane, came from ASCE design wind maps, and for seismic came from USGS seismic design level maps. So all of that information was combined to use as part of the inputs and ways to assign characteristics to each of the structures when we did the analysis. So one more thing to note on data collection and data processing. While our information on code adoption and the hazards themselves are hazard specific, one thing we learned in the prior studies is that a lot of the processing for our structure data, our building data, could be done in common among the three hazards up to a certain point. So when we leveraged CoreLogic national parcel data, we were actually able, instead of having to do unique data development for each hazard, to do a lot of these steps in common before handing off the structure data to each of the three analysis teams. So we started off with CoreLogic data of around 147 million parcels nationwide. Mentioned earlier, this is kind of a near national coverage. That data was then processed, first taking out any parcels that didn't have construction on them, then being filtered out based on the specific needs in this study. So for instance, we were looking at construction post-2000. So anything that had a construction date prior to 2000 were excluded. We also excluded data that might have had missing data that was needed for one or more of the hazards. So for instance, information about roof type that was needed for hurricane information. So we did that filtering. We got the information down to roughly 16 million parcels. We then did some additional analysis comparing the parcels with Bing footprints to take into account where building counts and parcel counts may be different. So for instance, you may have, let's say, an apartment building where you would have numerous parcels within one building. You may also have other instances where you have one parcel with multiple buildings. So the Bing footprints were used to do this processing to deal with cases where it wasn't a one-for-one relationship of structures to parcels. So in the end, we ended up with a little over 18 million structures nationwide built after 2000. That was then the beginning data set for each of the three hazards to then assign hazard specific characteristics and then do their resultant hazardous analysis and get losses avoided. This flow chart on the slide shows kind of our three main additional data sets needed for flood analysis. First, we needed to know at the structure level which structures had freeboard and which ones didn't. So we developed a nationwide at the community level freeboard adoption database from the year 2000 forward. We also developed flood profile information nationwide to be able to estimate for different flood return periods or occurrence intervals, the relative flood elevations for each structure. And then finally, we developed some new flood depth damage functions nationwide to be able to compare flood damage levels for different structure types in a consistent fashion. So all those came together, were assigned to individual structures, and then for those that did have freeboard, we calculated losses avoided. So that's our general flood methodology. So we started primarily with state sources and also national sources about code adoption in general, but also about state level adoptions. Information from organizations such as ASFPM was very helpful to know those parts of the country that starting in the year 2000 may have already had mandatory statewide freeboard adoption, and those that didn't, those that only had local adoption. We also made use of sources such as Community Rating System database, where as part of the CRS ratings, communities get credit for having freeboard. So we were able to look at that database with its multiple records over the years to get a sense of, as communities added into the CRS and then were evaluated, if they had freeboard and what levels of freeboard they may have. So these national sources, state sources, and local sources were all combined to then develop a national database at the community level so that we could be able to determine for any given building in any community built in 2000 or later whether or not it would be a reasonable assumption if they had freeboard or not. Some of the trends that we found in the National Freeboard Database is that we could group states in kind of three broad categories. A number of states that we called innovators have had freeboard since the year 2000 or even earlier as a mandatory statewide requirement. We also had other states that since 2000 have added statewide requirements as well. So we call those emergent. They may not have had it in 2000, but since then have adopted it in some level. And in many cases, it may be communities with the adoption of the 2015 ICC codes that have mandatory freeboard required within the floodplain. Outside of those two groups, we also had other states that are still limited, where the only freeboard adoption occurs at a local level and there's no statewide requirements for them. So you can see on this figure that the trends of the percent of structures built in the floodplain among these three groups show the trends as you would expect, where the ones that had mandatory statewide, the innovators, had a very high percentage with freeboard. Those that were emergent, as we get closer to modern day, their percent with freeboard has gone up. And then those that are limited have the least of the three. We decided as part of the study and working in conjunction with some of the Risk Rating 2.0 work to revisit the existing libraries of depth damage functions and look if we could come up with some new families or information that would be easier to apply in a nationwide setting such as this, where we have a full range of structure types. We have buildings that are in riverine hazards, also in coastal V zones. So what we came up with, you can see on this slide, is the concept of depth damage curve families, where each of the families of curves represents a certain structure type, such as a one-story deep foundation in this example. And then each of the curves represents conditions starting from kind of your typical riverine, going to a coastal still water, all the way up to your V zone with high wave action. So we found that the flood analysis produced average annualized losses avoided of almost $500 million or $500 million per year. The actual value of 484 million came from the analysis of roughly 800,000 buildings built after the year 2000 that were in the floodplain, of which a little bit over half, around 400,000 or 51%, were found to have freeboard. The average annualized loss per structure was around $1,200. You can see on this slide the top 10 states and the distributions around the country denoted at a county level. Some of the states were expected to be high, with high amounts of post-2000 growth, such as California, Texas, and Florida. Other states you can see that are on the top 10 list, but when you actually look at them on the mapping, you can see only certain areas with freeboard. Often these may be states that are in the limited category where they didn't have statewide adoption, but they did have local level adoption, often in cities with high flood risk. So if you look at Texas, for instance, the major urban centers around Dallas and Houston stick out there. In North Carolina, we found that post-2000 construction was just under 1 million structures, of which a little bit around 2 to 3% were found to be in the floodplain. The amount of freeboard, however, was only around 40% of the floodplain construction, so lower than the national average of 51%. The reason that North Carolina is lower is that there is currently not a statewide requirement for freeboard. So while many of the urban areas with flood risk do have freeboard requirements, but not requiring it statewide, there are a large number of communities, and you can see on this map, that have little to no freeboard and so little to no losses avoided associated with that. The reason that the state doesn't have a required freeboard is they actually specifically excluded it when the statewide adoption of the code series from 2015 was performed. So currently, the IRC and IBC 2015 have requirements for mandatory adoption of freeboard within the floodplain, but North Carolina decided to remove that. So that's the reason why you're seeing these slightly lower numbers than some of the national averages you might expect. So the communities that do have freeboard in North Carolina come from the data we found as part of the community rating system. One community in North Carolina that's a good example of freeboard adoption is Wrightsville Beach. They've been a member of CRS since the 1990s. Our records that we found within the CRS database has them with continuing freeboard requirements over the entire time frame of our study. So pretty much anything that's built in the floodplain is going to have some level of freeboard. You can see some examples in this graphic of some of the structures and how they're elevated up off the ground. In some cases, they're actually an open with no obstruction type of construction. In other cases, they may be doing NFIP compliant enclosures that have things like breakaway walls and flood vents to allow the water to go through in the case of when floods occur.
Thank you, Shane. While Shane focused on the flood module results, I also want to point out that our study found that most of the damage that the adoption of modern building codes has averted, $1.1 billion a year, is from provisions requiring protection against strong winds. Building codes that reduce flood risk save nearly $500 million a year, and codes that protect against earthquakes save $60 million a year, according to our study. In addition to the interesting findings related to freeboard, we also found that incorporating windborne debris protection requirements into the 2006 codes resulted in an increase in losses avoided of almost 20%. You may notice that the seismic losses avoided are lower than the other hazards. This is because our Western seismic states had developed and adopted earthquake-resistant building codes well before 2000, the benchmark year for our study. So the $60 million in average annualized losses avoided is a result of improvements to the code and underlying hazard maps since 2000. Both of these examples highlight the importance of continuously improving the model codes and adopting the latest versions. Our study found that 5 states make up the majority of the total average annualized losses avoided, and the study report dives into the factors driving those results. We also found that residential dwellings constitute about 85% of the building inventory, so improvements to residential code adoption pose a significant opportunity. The study report also identifies high-hazard, high-growth counties with limited I-code use. These are areas where the losses avoided aren't as high as they could be. Remember the third goal of the study, to incentivize greater code adoption? Well, we realized that a big nationwide technical study doesn't always motivate local change. So we developed a companion brochure to use our results to tell a compelling story for local officials and the public. Now, this is not an executive summary, although we do have one of those in our study report. Rather, it's a way for us to make our findings and results more approachable to a wider audience. We know that historic disasters bring real-life motivation. In fact, today's hazard-resistant codes incorporate many lessons learned from past disasters. We also know that motivations for local change always tie into local stories somehow. So the brochure starts by setting the stage for why codes are important in today's environment of increasing hazards and disasters. then provides regional examples of the effects of disasters on communities, highlights some communities that have successfully used codes to break the chain of destruction, and provides justification using our study results and a call to action and details on how to achieve greater code adoption in your community. This is a great tool for public officials and the public to raise awareness of the benefits of strong building codes and help them advocate for them in their communities. As we've shown, this study has demonstrated the monetary benefit of adopting hazard-resistant building codes and shows how they reduce losses during disasters. We launched the study in November 2020 in coordination with our partners and have been using our results to incentivize better code adoption ever since through our marketing strategy, our website, the brochure, and our companion resources. Now, one great example of coordination with our partners on outreach that I'm particularly excited about is May's Building Safety Month. This year's theme is Prevent, Prepare, Protect, Building Codes Safe. Now, in addition, we have ideas for how we can continue this work by looking at other hazards such as wildfires and tornadoes and other ways of leveraging our data. So in closing, I hope that you enjoyed learning more about our study and how building codes save. For more information, I encourage you to visit our website, download the brochure, check out the study, and reach out to help us create more building code advocates.
Thank you, Jonathan and Shane, for that presentation. Unfortunately, Jonathan was not able to make it today, so we have Dan Bass in his place from FEMA to help answer questions. Thank you, participants, for submitting several great questions. The first question I'd like to pose is from Kayla. Are there any plans to include wildfires in this study in the future? There are so many current local state battles occurring over wildfire building codes. It would be helpful to point to a study like this when communicating with communities.
All right. Hello, everyone. This is Dan Bass. I'm filling in for Jonathan Westcott. I'm an architect in the building science branch, so I stepped in to help him out because he couldn't be here. Yeah, that's a really good question. We have been discussing what further steps we could take, next steps, and that is a topic that has come up. There are no definitive plans at the moment for doing additional study, but we are talking about those at present. And the Wui fire is one of the topics that has come up for possible further investigation.
Great, thank you, Dan. The next question is, how was flood hazard identified for unmapped areas or lacking digital flood risk mapping?
I can do that one, Dan.
Yeah.
So one of the, I guess, fortunate things that we had for this study is the regulations for where you applied freeboard was limited to the actual official FEMA floodplain. So there's two things coincided. So areas where you have flood risk, but isn't actually part of the official FEMA mapping, wouldn't have the regulations in place that would have the freeboard there. So we do have instances, I think, throughout the study, we mentioned this idea that we're kind of doing lower bound analysis or, making some conservative estimates. So we expect there may be areas where buildings were constructed with freeboard that are outside of these official mapped areas, but that would have to be identified as part of some future studies as well. So the short answer is the application of the codes is limited to the special flood hazard areas. So it wasn't as high of a priority as it might be in other studies.
Great, thanks, Shane. Next question, could you explain a bit more about how you estimated building elevations?
I can catch that one. In the assumptions behind the study, if we identified a building that was with freeboard, then our two scenarios were really with and without freeboard, assuming that it was built to NFIP compliance. So in the modeling of a building, we essentially had a scenario where the first floor was at the 100-year or the first floor was higher up. So that assumption of always knowing that the first floor in both of our scenarios were at 2 set points or 2 return periods allowed the modeling to be more straightforward. Our expectation, though, is again with our assumptions, if we actually went out and surveyed actual buildings, that the actual elevations on certain buildings, you saw the Wrightsville Beach examples, they might have even gone up and above that minimum freeboard because they did a full story rather than maybe, let's say it was only needed to be 4 or 5 feet above the ground. So that would be one part of follow-up studies, as well as to go back and do some validation of the assumptions that went into things like where the first floors really were.
Great. We are at 9:30. Shane and Dan, thank you very much for answering those questions. And we will move on to our next presentation.
Thank you. And thanks for everyone for attending.
Yep. Thanks, everybody.
Our next presentation will be given by Lisa Graff with the co-presenter Rebecca Lightshoe. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that last name correctly. Lisa is a GIS team member at the University of Illinois at Illinois State Water Survey, a GIS professional and a HAZUS trained professional and a certified floodplain manager. She is currently leading a team to develop local hazard mitigation plans for counties in Illinois, as well as using GIS to assess the impact of flooding in Illinois. Please welcome Lisa and Rebecca. Their presentation is titled Shorewood, Illinois, Loss Avoidance Study, 24 years and 17 floods later. Take it away, Lisa.
Hi, thank you for joining us. I'm Lisa Graff, and I'm co-presenting with my coworker, Rebecca Lightshoe. And our presentation is about the village of Shorewood, Illinois, a loss avoidance, looking at 17 floods and 24 years. First, I'm going to go through what a loss avoidance study is if you're not familiar with loss avoidance studies, a little bit about the project and study area background, mitigation actions and mitigation project information about the village of Shorewood, how we collected the data for this study, how we calculated the losses avoided. We'll review some of the study results and then wrap up with lessons learned and some takeaways. So first, we're going to start with the numbers. This is proof that mitigation works. Right now, for every dollar spent, the village of Shorewood has saved $2.24, or that has been saved. Below, you can see that the National Institute of Building Sciences interim report showed a 7-to-1 loss avoidance ratio for federally funded riverine flood mitigation projects. So Shorewood, after 24 years, has saved at least $2.24 for every mitigation dollar spent, and this will continue to accrue indefinitely. And on the left is the cover of our final report and a link to where you can find the report with all of the information that goes into a lot more detail than we have time for today. What is a loss avoidance study? A loss avoidance study examines losses that would have occurred if mitigation measures were not taken. In the case of Shorewood, if the 56 properties examined were not acquired and demolished, what types of losses would have occurred from flooding over the past 24 years in this area?
So why did we pick Shorewood? Well, we picked Shorewood. We were utilizing state funds to show why mitigation matters. This was through Congress's Hurricane Ike recovery allocation to the state of Illinois. And we were using it to help advance state goals through the State Hazard Mitigation Plan, through the Illinois Department of Natural Resources Strategic Plan, for FEMA, for all of them who were desiring additional loss avoidance studies to show the value of mitigation. We wanted to pick a community where the technical requirements for an LAS exist, but where we could also tell a good story, where we had immediate buy-in from local emergency managers, the police chief, and where there was a long history. We wanted to talk about the local culture, values, history, also environmental and emotional costs and benefits, and residents' experiences. And the local government for Shorewood had an array of complementary plans. They had Parks and Recreation Plan, U.S. Army Corps Watershed Plan, County River Trail Plan, Economic Revitalization with a focus on the river. So people are overwhelmed by risk, climate change, now add new economic instabilities, the everyday threat of a pandemic. Scare tactics alone are not sufficient to change behavior. So why do we create plans? Why do we produce flood studies and maps? It's to convey risk. But what is the end goal? It's to change behavior and policies, to reduce risk, to eliminate risk, to be prepared for risks that cannot yet be mitigated, and then to prevent future risk, the most impactful in the long run. Next slide. So going on to Shorewood, Grinton, which you might have seen in the previous image, it was previously called Grinton. It's a small milling town along the DuPage River, 45 miles southwest of Chicago and near the Illinois-Michigan Canal. It eventually became a sleepy summer cottage town named Shorewood that over time became more permanent. Many of the original summer cottages from the 1940s were built right to the water's edge, the foundation still visible at locations. The aerial is going north up the river and passing over a footbridge, you'll see referenced again later, where you see trees and open space that were adjacent to the river on both sides. Those were homes just only a decade or two ago. Next slide. This is a picture on the left from the 1996 event where the DuPage River seems to have no bound, pouring into the Shorewood Beach subdivision, the oldest neighborhood in the village. The map shows the flood depths and the extents of the 1996 event, the second costliest flood in the state of Illinois at that time. The township assessor, a lifetime resident, explained that while they were always aware and prepared for minor flooding, nothing of the magnitude and speed had ever been anticipated before. Most residents did not have flood insurance. Owning the homes free and clear or purchasing them before mandatory notice was required by banks. Generations of families grew up in the same home and spent countless summer months diving off of floating docks in the river, sharing Friday fish fries after the mill would dam up the area on Thursday evenings, and every kind of river pastime imaginable in everyday life. When the majority of homes were declared substantially damaged and could not be rebuilt, the village, and a very strong mayor advocate, sought funding through the state and FEMA and other entities to buy out residents and forever change the heart of Shorewood. I won't go into the details because it could be a whole presentation, but after an initial round of FEMA-supported buyouts and CDBG and DNR, a decade passed, and after a few more floods, a large one in 2006, 11 other residents approached the village to sell. The village, in the meantime, had anticipated buying out the remaining high-risk properties and had incrementally set aside development impact fees for future capital improvement projects, and in this case, buyouts. The village did not approach the residents to avoid artificially inflating the home values, but waited for residents to approach them individually. Next slide.
Thanks, Rebecca. A little bit more background on those flood events. That flood event occurred in July 1996, and maybe some of you are in Illinois and remember that. It resulted in federally declared disaster DR 1129, which affected several counties in Illinois. 43 properties were acquired and demolished after this disaster for a total of 56 properties in this area by 2010. And we found that 17 flood events would have impacted at least one of these properties over the last 24 years. And the largest one would have impacted 44 homes, and that was an event in 2013. What do you need to do a loss avoidance study? So part of the reason we picked Shorewood is due to its location near a USGS stream gauge. It's really important to have a stream gauge nearby in order to tie in the flood heights, the gauge heights to a model in order to estimate flood heights and then flood depths, which we determined using LIDAR, which represents the ground elevations. Then we also needed to find the assets. What properties would have flooded? What were the properties that were bought out? So our attention was brought to Shorewood because as part of the update to the state hazard mitigation plan, we developed a buyout database, which was a GIS database showing areas of acquisitions. And Shorewood showed several in this area. And from that, we started to create a building inventory. And we used assessors data as well as survey data that was collected for this, including a first floor height is really important to estimate the potential damages that would have occurred if those properties were still in place. And to do that, we used the HAZA software developed by FEMA to look at the impact on the structures. We also referenced the loss avoidance methodology that FEMA published in 2011, as well as the FEMA benefit cost analysis toolkit to estimate some of the additional benefits of the project in this area. Here you can see there are a few pictures of historic property cards, and that was one method of data collection. We went into data entry mode, looked at all of the photos and the notes on these property cards so that we were accurately representing which homes were purchased and demolished. So we created a GIS point feature class, and each acquired home was a point in this feature class. And we placed the points using a combination of historical aerial photography, as well as historic annotated tax maps and parcel maps, because a lot of the parcels that existed in 1996 had been modified after the buyouts were completed. So we needed to use that historic information to refine the location of the home, because as you know, the location of a home in proximity to flooding is really important to determine the amount of damage. So the township assessor kindly let us use the conference room to lay out all the property cards and take photos for this. All right, Rebecca.
Another important type of information that's valuable to collect about losses avoided and the real impact of mitigation is anecdotal. It's through storytelling conversations. So here's one of the current great advocates, a picture for the buyouts in Shorewood, Chief Klima. He's pointing at a storm grate and telling us that when the river gauge reaches 11.54 feet, I visit this grate, and if it's bubbling out, that's when I know I have to visit certain homes. He said that flooding is the 10th now on his list for top emergency response concerns, 10th, as in it worked. He just wants to keep it that way. He's always wary when planners like myself and economic development professionals, they see tourism and infrastructure. He sees avoidable emergency response. On the right, the picture shows where buyouts were completed. And it's hard to see, but visible along the river's edge, you can actually see the foundations for a few of the homes built right up to the side of the river. Thanks, Lisa.
So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the types of losses avoided that we looked at for this study, as well as the benefits that we calculated. So as I mentioned before, physical damage to the building and contents, and we used HAZUS to calculate that. Also, the cost of residents being displaced, lives and businesses disrupted. If your home floods, you have to deal with that. You have to deal with insurance claims, find a place to live or to stay temporarily. Maybe it disrupted your business. There are a lot of things that people living through floods need to take time to deal with. So that's one of the things we looked at, as well as the mental stress and the anxiety caused by living through a disaster, living through a flood. You know, a resident we talked to said that she could definitely see the impact of her father having his lifelong home, you know, kind of taken away from him, and just the stress and strain that caused to him and their entire family as well. The loss of productivity at work. living through a disaster has an impact on your productivity. I mean, we're living through one right now, right? How has that impacted your productivity at work? Luckily, we were able to complete this loss avoidance study through the pandemic, but maybe it was a little behind schedule, I'll admit. And then finally, we looked at the environmental benefits of the mitigated area as green open space. So I'll say this is just a taste of all the tables that we have in the report. If you really want to dig into all the details and all the tables, please download the report. That is on, I think, the second slide. So this table, we looked at the investment by and return on investment by flood events. So you can see on the left, we have the year and the date of all the flood events, the number of the structures included. So that is looking at, okay, which properties were bought out by that year, the impacted number of structures, and then the estimated losses and benefits as well. And then you can see how the losses avoided ratio keeps accumulating after each flood event, and that will continue to increase as time goes by and this area floods again. So to summarize again, for every dollar invested, $2.24 has been saved. So the total investment, total losses avoided, I'm sorry, was about 13.6 million. There was an $8 million project investment over this project lifetime, which led to a loss avoidance ratio of 1.7. We looked at these additional environmental benefits, which were pretty substantial, about 4.3 million. And including that, the total return on investment is 224%. All right, Rebecca's gonna tell us about some of the takeaways from this project.
So some takeaways from us as practitioners. You never know what the numbers are going to reveal at the end of a report like this. But again, as Lisa summarized, we had a return on investment evidenced of 2.24, which is great. You know, after 10 years after the final buyout, and this will continue to accrue event after event and hopefully remind developers and future Shorewood residents and elected officials why development should remain out of these high-risk areas. The second point, the village set aside development impact fees for future capital improvement projects and anticipated needing additional buyout funds. Well, this is like an awesome testament to the observed success by the community. We didn't realize that more properties were acquired after the initial 1996 buyout, which until much further on, which led us to quite a bit of unanticipated time searching through local, state, federal records, trying to reconcile what happened to these mystery properties that were demolished, but not on the original grant roll. Questions about how they were funded, when they were acquired. It was pretty complicated following the paper trail from 1996 to later events and changes in property ownership, grants that were accepted but then rejected, a new village hall building and records, new staff, etc. Which leads us to the third takeaway, that quality outreach and writing, it always takes more time than you anticipate. But boy, you know, it's worth it. The time invested in having conversations about not only the numbers, but about the event and its impact on real people, why we do any of this mitigation stuff. It adds breadth and sensitivity and details that would have been overlooked, like, for example, the capital improvement funding buyouts. You want to research early in the process before you engage even. Find out what are current issues, concerns, and initiatives, and find out what's been completed in the past. Just a little time will afford multiplied benefits down the line. And weaving into the fourth takeaway, people want to share their experiences. They want to take the time and provide that feedback to you. And if you want anyone to read the findings and learn about the community's experiences, connecting through people through a story is effective. It's how we've always communicated risk and lessons over human history. Storytelling also ties into knowing your audience. You do not use the same language or detail when explaining risk and results to engineers versus residents. And at the end of a report or a meeting, people want to understand and they want to be understood. So while this was a definite success, and residents who we spoke with expressed their gratitude for the programs and how the village and state and federal groups informed them, there is a real sense of loss, of grieving and trauma from the event itself, and then losing one sense of community. We asked 2 families if they had any pictures to give us a taste of life along the river in its heyday. And we were told by both that all pictures were sadly lost to the flood, that the community is gone and the pictures capturing those memories. And that is a story that's also worthy to include in a loss avoidance study. And it's maybe even a more important message to take to heart about why mitigation and prevention are so necessary. And that's it for me. Thanks, Lisa.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, and for everybody for attending this session. I think we will put the link to the report in the chat if you want to click and download it. But here are our emails and then our general group website. So thank you for attending.
Thank you, Lisa and Rebecca, for that great presentation. We have a number of questions from participants. The first one is, how did you estimate the costs associated with business disruption in the Shorewood loss avoidance study?
Great, thanks for asking that question. So for the methodology in our project, and I mentioned the report, we have all the details in our report as well. We use the methodology described in the loss avoidance study by FEMA, and then also supplemented that with the current BCA tool, the 6.0 BCA tool details as well for specific numbers for the business disruption.
And then the second question, can you provide details on the environmental benefits?
Sure, we thought that was important to count towards the benefits in this study because it's being maintained as open area, and I know that's at a cost to communities typically, so we really wanted to try to put a value on that. And so that, again, we referenced the BCA tool by FEMA, and I emailed the BCA help line, and they sent the full report of how they develop the environmental benefits. So it was on an acreage basis, and there's, so we had to estimate, it was really important to know when each structure was demolished, so we wouldn't count that acreage towards the benefits for that current year. So for each year, we determined how much open acreage there was after buildings were demolished, because when it was acquired doesn't mean it was demolished that year. So, we referenced aerial photography. I don't have the number exactly per acreage off the top of my head, but it is all referenced in the report. So hopefully I answered your question there.
Great, thank you. And I think this question is related. Have you considered water quality improvement benefits?
Let me see. I'll have to check. I think it may have been part of the environmental benefits. I'm kind of scrolling through the report right now because there were, I think probably about 8 different considerations for, okay, let's see here. I'm looking at it now. Climate regulation, water retention, air quality, erosion control, pollination, recreation, aesthetic values. Okay, so water quality wasn't considered as part of the environmental benefits, but that's a great idea. I don't necessarily, it's not something that we have developed in our group, but if someone does know of a reputable estimation for the value of water quality, because, that is true, that is another benefit. And it is important to be able to put numbers on some of these other benefits as well. So thanks for the question. Consider that in a future study, hopefully.
Great. The next question, considering that FEMA HMA programs are voluntary, what percentage of your acquisitions were funded via FEMA HMA grant funds versus direct funding by the village?
That's a good question. The bulk of the buyouts were after that 1996 event, and so those were funded by HMA. And I would say, I'm estimating here, but probably about 85 to 90% of the buyouts were funded by HMA. There were just about 10 to 15 properties in the later years that were acquired through the community's funds. So really a lot of that was upfront after that flood, because a lot of the homes were substantially damaged and weren't habitable after that flood event.
And then another related question, does the return on investment include village funded later buyouts?
Yes, the return on investment includes all of the acquisitions from FEMA funds, from the village funds as well, and all of the losses that were avoided from all of those projects.
Next question is, did you track demographic information about the buyouts and disaggregate the data based on race?
I took a look at some of the census data, and that was in 1996. So the nature of, the data collected kind of changed a little bit from then. We didn't consider that in our report, but just from glancing at it, and also from, as Rebecca mentioned, we did talk to people that had lived there. It did seem to be a lot of older people that lived there, maybe retirees, and that were affected in the buyout and the flooding.
Okay. Next question, did the local people feel like they were being listened to?
So are you talking about as far as completing this study or in the buyout process? I'm curious. I'll try to answer for our study. We had a great champion in the sheriff there, and he had been around since, before 1996. So he gave us the tour and was able to, explain everything that happened, introduced us to the assessor whose parents were affected by the flood. So we did meet a lot of people, and they were actually very excited for the community's story to be told, and to talk about it and to look at the impacts and the benefits that came out from this event, because there were a lot of family homes lost, memories, and things of that nature. And so it was good to hear from that. As far as the buyouts, it was a difficult situation for everybody. And there's a memorial, like a plaque that memorialized the 43 homes that were lost to the flood. So, people weren't obviously happy about their family home being purchased, but I don't think that there didn't seem to be a lot of pushback as far as that first acquisition went. And then, in the later years, subsequently with the village funded buyouts, those were, the village was approached by the homeowners. So those were proactive homeowners that were looking to get out of the floodplain. So, so that was good.
Great. Well, thank you, Lisa. Let's do one more quick question. How many of the homes had an NFIP policy?
We didn't look at how many homes had an NFIP flood policy. Many of the homes were already purchased outright, and in the family for years is, you know, it was a lot of retirees that had been living there for like 40 years and things such as that. So, but that's a good question and definitely something to consider for future projects. Thanks.
Great. Well, thank you, Lisa. And one of the other questions that was posted was about getting a link posted in the chat, and I'll work with you to get that into the chat here after this presentation, as we get the next presentation started. So our third presentation today is by John Callen and John Peterson of JEO. The title is Bomb Cyclone Shelter, Why Grand Island Stayed Dry in the Flood of 2019. John and John are professional engineers at JEO. John Callen has 17 years of industry experience working with flood risk and floodplain management. He's a senior engineer at JEO, and in past parts of his career, he spent 4 years as the NFIP state coordinator for Nebraska. Take it away, John and John.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining our presentation today regarding the bomb cyclone in Nebraska in 2019 and the impacts on the Grand Island region of Nebraska. My name is John Callen with JEO Consulting Group, and with me today is John Peterson. Hello. On the project engineering, and I've worked on some of the H&H and floodplain management related aspects of the project. So today we want to tell you a little bit about the background of this project and how the timely completion of a very long project helped the Central Platte NRD in Nebraska and the city of Grand Island avoid some very significant consequences of a flood event that occurred in 2019. This project covers a wide area, and we'll show some maps here in a second of where those impact areas and project elements are. But it was a project conceived back in the early 2000s and really started implementation about 2005, and with the goal of flood risk reduction for a significant part of the city of Grand Island, which is a city of about 50,000 in central Nebraska, and also reducing flood damage to crops, infrastructure in the project area. One of the ultimate goals of the project is not only flood risk reduction, but a flood insurance rate map revision. And of course, an element is to just promote understanding of flood risk and floodplain management for the residents of Grand Island. Key project elements, on the ground, the physical project is several dry dams, which are basically detention style facilities, but built more like a traditional dam. The large detention cell is, the terrain varies a lot in this area, and the detention cells in the lowland part of the terrain, which is sort of typical of what you might expect for central Nebraska, Great Plains, just very flat. And the levee, which I'll explain in a minute, helps prevent certain overflows from occurring from one basin to another at a critical point in the project system. As I mentioned, other components that are being worked on and we'll talk about. The letter map revision is completed for the project. That was also, as I'm sure many of you are familiar, a lengthy process. And we're also currently working on some flood alert components and flood forecasting and flood risk awareness efforts. So to give you an overview of the project location and the key elements in the city of Grand Island, Grand Island is about an hour and a half west of Lincoln in the central part of the state. And these are the dry dams referenced here, Dry Creek, Prairie Creek, or these upland dams. The detention cell is on the Silver Creek system. And this levee is connection between, this levee is a connection between Silver Creek and Moores Creek, and a location where some historical overflows have occurred during flood events. This slide just gives you an idea of where the key flow locations are. And in particular, when you get to the point of where you're close to Grand Island, you'll notice Prairie Creek and Silver Creek come close together. Silver Creek and Moores Creek system are also close together. Historically, when high flows have occurred, there's been sort of a cascading effect where flow potentially could flow into Silver Creek and then potentially could outflow from Silver Creek into Moores Creek. And as you can see, this is the area of the community that's at high risk, not to mention the agricultural land in between that could potentially be impacted. So the overall goal of the project is to reduce these flows. And as you can see here, with project, that overflow potential is completely removed, and overflow potential here and overall flow rates through the system are substantially decreased, which fortunately for the community, the project was almost completed in 2019, except for some very small items on the levee system, which John will talk about. And when the big one hit the state of Nebraska in March 2019, the project had a lot of benefits because of its status as far as completion. So we're going to show you a quick video here that gives you an overview of what some of those benefits are, and then we'll talk more about those as we go through the presentation. So that video shows you a little bit of an overview of some of the impacts of the flooding in Nebraska and the Grand Island area specifically. John's going to talk a little bit more about that. The flood event was precipitated by what we referred to as the bomb in the title, which is the bomb cyclone meteorological event. The ground was quite frozen to a significant depth, and we had deep snow over a lot of the state when that occurred. And we had a quick warm up and a rain on snow event. And that ended up having significant impacts statewide and precipitated a lot of runoff volume in this area as well as elsewhere in Nebraska. So John's going to talk a little bit more about the construction of the project and the site specific impacts of the bomb cyclone.
Thanks. So, like John pointed out earlier, all the components of the system, we had 4 dry dams. The baseline design for all these dry dams was the 100-year storm event. So this picture right here is of dam number 4. So this is a low hazard structure. This one was the one that was probably stressed the most. Water approached the auxiliary spillway crest It didn't actually flow through it, so that was good. But this one, definitely had a lot of water. Like we said, these are dry dams, and so typically there's no permanent pool, and now this here pool is almost 70 acres of just floodwater storage. Dams number 1 and 2 are built to a bit higher standard. They're actually high hazard dams, and so just to balance some of the geotechnical criteria and earthwork and some other items, these two dams number 1 and 2 are set probably well above a 200-year storm level for the auxiliary spillway crest. So they were definitely not stressed nearly as much as dam number 4 was. We had really the only damage we had on these dams was some wave erosion. You might have been able to tell from the video, but during the storm event, there was also some pretty significant winds, gusts on the magnitude of 50 to 60 miles per hour. So you can imagine just kind of the wave damage that could cause. But really, some wave damage, but not anything, too critical or too concerning. Now, the detention cell, again, was designed to contain the 100-year flood event. This particular detention cell covers about a square mile and holds about 2,800 acre feet of floodwaters. This detention cell actually filled up pretty quickly, and then the auxiliary spillway flowed for several days. So, it held up well. There really wasn't any damage to the detention cell itself, but the auxiliary spillway was definitely utilized. You can also see in this picture here on the northern or on the upper part of the picture, there's a lot of water that was not regulated by our structures. John will talk about that here in a bit, but there was some kind of unexpected flows that we saw in our system.
And John, I think this is the downstream outlet of the detention cell, isn't it?
Yes, it is. So you can see right in the kind of the center of the photo, that little white area is the auxiliary spillway of the detention cell. So another picture here of the detention cell full up. That actually is not ice on the water there. That's geese. So this event happened in March, when the migration season was happening. So pretty cool to see all the waterfowl that was out there. Typically, this detention cell is a fantastic wetland area, lots of waterfowl, habitat, birds, bees, things like that. So it's a pretty cool sight to see. And just some more photos of the detention cell. Like I said earlier, it covers about a square mile, so it's a pretty significantly sized structure. And just some more of the same here. So now here is the levee, just downstream of the detention cell. We kind of refer to this as our last line of defense. So the levee kind of runs along the center of the photo here, maybe off to the center, just to the right. The left side, you can see the water is actually Prairie Creek overflows, but you can see the levee itself is holding back the Silver Creek flows, and on the right side, it's dry. So Grand Island is just off to the right and above on the picture. Here's just getting a little further downstream along the levee. So the levee, the earthwork portion of the levee was complete at this time, and the drainage structures were installed. Vegetation, though, had not really established yet. That was really about the only remaining construction component. So, we're pretty fortunate that we were at this point in construction, but still kind of nerve-wracking too, not knowing that it's not complete exactly. But again, this is kind of the downstream end of the levee. The city of the Grand Island's just off to the top of the picture here, but you can see if you look closely, the water in relation to the levee is actually getting up into the freeboard section, which is always a little nerve-wracking, but that's okay because it performed well. Really, there was just only some minor erosion damage on the wet side of the levee, nothing that was of significant concern. Next slide. Here's just kind of looking back to the west at all the floodwaters coming through the area. So the levee's right there on the far left side of the photo, but that's Prairie Creek and Silver Creek combining here. Again, it held up almost perfectly from our standpoint. So we were very, very happy with how the system performed as a whole. This is looking downstream, so the city's on the right, and then this is the floodwater on the left, and just kind of bypassing the city.
So thank you, John. Appreciate that. And John mentioned a minute ago, and when we saw one of those photos was this area that showed the auxiliary spillway. And we had a couple of things occur during this event. So the return period of the event is more on the lines of a 500-year or 0.2% annual chance runoff event. We also had a significant volume of runoff because of the snowmelt aspect. And one of the things that occurred is very unexpected is this river system called Wood River, which is south of Grand Island, actually came over the basin divide and contributed some flow downstream of the detention cells. And so going forward, one of the things we're looking at through some other projects, including the Upper Prairie Silver Moors Flood Alert Project, which I'll talk about in a moment, and an actual NRCS Watershed Flood Protection Operations Project for Wood River that we are also working on, is how to manage this potential additional risk during really high flood events. Because even though the system overall performed, there were some areas impacted by flooding where it was unexpected because of this additional flow contribution. And another element that we'll consider going forward with flood alert and operations is just road access and access to the individual site features of the project just for observation and maintenance during a flood event. This is just an overview. So as we look at benefits and lessons learned and follow up from the event, one of the things we looked at was an approximation of the potential inundation area had the levee not been in place. And this is what that looks like. And we kind of did this for the purposes of assessing the project benefits and basically the damages avoided looking at this information. And, you know, there's really some major benefits monetarily, approximately $47 million from a single event, essentially justified the project by itself through this one event. And as you can see, a significant number of homes and businesses and cropland with reduced flood risk. So some of the other parts of this project that are really important to the outcomes include this flood control stroll outreach effort. This is something that was completed after the flooding to kind of educate people about flood risk, why they didn't see these impacts, the benefits of the project, and flood risk and flood safety overall. And it was, seems so long ago, only 2019, when we could do these things, be out and gathered to talk about this stuff. Hopefully that's coming back soon. Other elements, you know, some of the sort of bottom line stuff was the COMAR and LOMAR, conditional letter of map provision and letter of map provision. We did get that COMAR was started a lot earlier than that, but we didn't get approval until 2018. Fortunately, we were able to get that approval, and so we implemented the project around and submitted the LOMAR that benefit pretty quickly, and some significant flood insurance savings on top of the real flood risk reduction. And this just is an overview of the revision of the flood zones when going from pre to post letter of map revision. And that's just a more close-in view of the city of Grand Island. And right here is where the levee is, and that overflow risk is reduced coming in this direction toward the city from Silver Creek. So sort of final things and what's next in the future. It's really exciting aspect we're working on is this flood alert system. what we're doing with this is, the letter vision, H&H modeling, and prior H&H modeling use best available data and practices, but it was based on, standard assumptions about flow timing and other characteristics that you consider with hydrology and hydraulics. This is sort of taking it to the next level, and we're working on this right now. We started working on it last year, actually looking more at, so the watershed didn't have any existing really monitoring equipment. We're putting out our own monitoring equipment so that we can look at precipitation flow and flood depth observations, connect those to some upgraded H&H models, and use those for calibration and verification, and continuous refinement to where the NRD and the city of Grand Island can use that for operational purposes and understand what their flood risk is under certain scenarios. For example, after the March flood event, there was another moderate sized rain that came through not too long after that, and the NRD wasn't sure how much they should be concerned about ongoing flood risk with the water in the detention cell and dry dams already being high. So by doing this, that will allow us to help them understand that better. And also, as we noted, Wood River overflow variables, we can take those into account with this effort now, and just look at a lot of different scenarios of rainfall distribution, intensity, overflow impacts, antecedent moisture condition, and things like that with the flood modeling. This just is an overview of how the effort relates to the system. The stars are some of the places we're actually picking up flow data and logging that. So flow depth with a rating curve that we translate into flow, and our hydrologic model and hydraulic models are now geared towards the entire watershed, so we can have a watershed approach to that information. And that concludes our presentation. I would really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this today, and we would be glad to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, John and John, for that great presentation. We have several questions lined up in the queue. The first one is, how do these mitigation measures impact communities downstream?
Yeah, thanks for the question. In terms of general flood risk, the downstream impact should be minimal to none. It overall should be beneficial. There really aren't any significant communities in the path of flood risk downstream of Grand Island on these particular flood sources either. I know with the study that was done as part of the design, other aspects were looked at, such as depletions to the Platte River. John Peterson may be able to address that aspect a little bit more.
Right. Yeah. I mean, in general, the goal of the project was to detain flow and reduce the volume and peak flows through Grand Island. So, even further downstream, those flows, that flow reductions continued.
Great. The next question is, were climate change and future precipitation scenarios considered in the design?
So I'll give my answer, and John may be able to add, but generally speaking, this design was done or initiated almost 15 years ago. So in the overall process of the project, those thought processes weren't really in the lexicon at that time. It is something we are addressing with the flood alert project that I mentioned at the end of the presentation, where we are looking at how these different intensities and distributions of precipitation impact day-to-day operation of the project. I know it would have been ideal, obviously, to do that up front, but the project is built with some resilience into it based on our analyses in terms of the event that actually occurred in March 2019 was closer to a 0.2% annual chance event, and it performed well. But that's something we're addressing sort of in the future with our ongoing work.
Great. A related question, what standard of protection or return period was the target for this project?
So the target of flood risk reduction in design was 1% annual chance. Like I said, there's the detention cell itself is a high hazard structure, so it's designed with a PMP, and so it's got some resilience built into it. Likewise, the levee structure, we over-designed that a little bit to be resilient and have freeboard to the 0.2% annual chance event, which is essentially what we saw in March 2019.
Great. Next question. I understand that this is a flood risk reduction project. Was groundwater recharge a consideration in the development of the project, location and design and construction of the project features?
John, is that one you can take?
Yeah, I can take that. So groundwater recharge was not really considered for this particular project just because the city of Grand Island already has a high groundwater table. So we were actually trying to avoid some recharge, especially for the detention cell as we were closer to the city. So we did have more of a clay compacted layer on the bottom of the detention cell to kind of minimize that recharge or seepage potential.
Great. Next question, did you incorporate any habitat enhancement components as part of the flood control project?
I'll take that one too, John. Yes, that detention cell, kind of like I mentioned in the presentation, is covers about a square mile, and that square mile is all basically wetland habitat. So for our 404 permitting, we did have to do quite a bit of mitigation, and that was the mitigation site right there. So it's basically a square mile of just habitat and environmental improvements.
Great. Was it difficult acquiring the land for the dam and the detention cell?
The detention cell was pretty easy to acquire because a lot of that was already government property in some way, shape, or form. The dams, we did have to go through eminent domain on some of the properties. So I don't know if you've ever dealt with that before, but that's never an easy process. But it was all done. So we're good.
Great. That is our last question. Thank you to all of our presenters today, and thank you for all the questions, the great questions coming in from the participants. That really makes these presentations come alive. The next live session will be at 11 o'clock Central Time. It'll be our first plenary. In the meantime, I invite you to explore the conference website, go visit the exhibit hall, and see what other great content has been pulled together for us this year. Have a great conference and a great Tuesday. Thank you.